Thank you.
I got a bit of a disclaimer. I just flew back from London after 2 weeks abroad, so I might just nod off right in the middle of this.
I just flew down from San Francisco.
Well, that doesn't count.
No,
so did I. And we have actually a long history. We didn't talk about that. Gosh, when did we first meet? It was when you joined Sony in like 90s?
92 is when I joined Sony.
Wow. So all
back
the
when they were
legacy
an unintentional games company.
So we've been side by side through a lot of, basically most of my career.
Crystal
right?
Dynamics, I think, was probably
Crystal
the first
Dynamics,
time.
Soul Reaver, Legacy
Soul Reaver,
of
yeah,
Kain.
absolutely.
I remember showing you Soul Reaver 2.
I remember playing it.
Yeah, Uncharted, obviously, right? So long history together. Anyway, so it's very fun to be able to be here with you and talk about all this.
Well, thank you
And
for doing
I'm
this.
gonna
And
put that somewhere.
thank you to Dean and for the GamesBeat team and the VentureBeat team for having us here today. I'm one of the people that Dean referenced that has never been at GamesBeat before, GamesBeat Summit before. This is the first time I've had a chance to be here, so
Same.
we're all newbies. So
Yes,
great.
yes, absolutely. So hopefully this is less of an interview, more of a conversation.
Okay,
And
let's go.
you could just glare at me if I ask something that you just don't want to answer. But see, Michael set me up pretty nicely too.
I think I'm going to have Michael open all of our presentations.
I know. He basically just rips the Band-Aid off, so it's cool. Look, so I've been out there. I mean, I'm out there having meetings and conversations with lots of people and evangelizing this idea that cloud-based gaming and real-time streaming experiences are going to revolutionize our industry. And depending on who you talk to, I mean, you get different estimates of how many years before we think this transformation is really going to take hold. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, about kind of how long out we think we're looking before our industry is radically transformed. I don't mean just our industry, I mean entertainment.
Well, I think games has done a pretty amazing job over the last 40 years, and some of the people in this room were the founding fathers of it, getting us to this incredible point. So we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and all we want to do is to expand the audience and democratize access to games, as well as democratizing the creation of games. And if we can focus on those two things, getting games to any screen in your life, as simple as a click of a button, bringing together those worlds of playing and watching games into one platform, then who knows how high it can go. Plus the rising tide of broadband infrastructure around the planet, maybe accelerated by what's going on in 5G as well. You know, those are all positive wind in our sails. But it's not going to happen overnight, and I don't want anyone to be under any illusions that this is going to be a switch that we flick and then suddenly we're all in this utopia of cloud-based gaming. It's going to take a while to get to the kind of scale that we think we can get to.
Yeah, but I think it'll be so transformative. And to me, I mean, we know how long it takes to make some of this content, right? So when people make estimates of 2 to 5 years, I don't know if that's ambitious or whether that's a sort of a reasonable estimate that this will be widespread and we'll be reaching a mainstream audience with this. But I look at, you know, how it transformed, you know, the TV and film industries, how it transformed the music industry. And obviously, you know, one of the things we talked about is that with the rise of the discussion around cloud-based gaming and you know, the advent of real-time streaming, that I think there's some anxiety as well as some excitement about what that might mean for our industry. And you've probably been reading various comments and things like that, as you know, after your announcement. What are the things that you'd want to address about that, both in terms of the anxiety and enthusiasm?
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I think it's natural that any new evolution in the industry is going to have pause for thought and think about what does that mean for me. I think Michael addressed very articulately some of the challenges and the opportunities. But I'm old enough and, you know, long enough in the tooth to remember when conversations around games moving to CD-ROM were considered heresy.
That's right.
And so, you know, I think there was,
right?
oh my goodness, you know, these are just going to be like cartridge games, but only longer and more boring. You know, there was a very significant concern about what that would mean for accessibility to games, and maybe we're kind of coming full circle. I don't know, but I think what I would ask everybody in the room and anybody who's watching to think about is the opportunity, what this means for dramatically expanding the audience, what this means for accessibility of games, what this means for reaching a potentially unprecedented number of people and bringing those incredible stories and adventures and worlds to people's lives. And I think we can touch the human race in a way that can be just as impactful as any literature or television.
Right, and obviously up until now, you could say that for some people, obviously, that experience has been locked behind a barrier that's either financial or just the cultural, or the intimidation factor of a piece of hardware or a controller that you don't necessarily understand. So one of the things I'm most excited about is the fact that I know you guys have talked about how you think this will 10x the audience, but I mean, but that's real. I mean, what are the numbers that we have based on kind of the hardcore gamers that we, are appealing to now versus the much larger mainstream community?
I mean, the biggest consoles, I think PlayStation 2 is about 140, 150 million machines sold, but I'm sure other people in the room know the data better than I do, but the actual usage was probably in the only high double-digit millions. Mobile is clearly the biggest platform for playing games on the planet. There's roughly 2 billion smartphone players on the planet, and that number seems to continue to grow. So although console is and high-end PC is where a lot of the tastemakers are and a lot of the innovation happens in certainly in graphics and visuals and gameplay, the volume is all in mobile. Mm-hmm. And so maybe we can see a unification of those two worlds. And I think that we wouldn't be able to share specific numbers on volume projections today, not least of which is we're in a quiet period. Yeah. But I think it's not up to us to say what we think. It's just, the one thing I would say is that in the European Union, access to the internet is considered a definition of a human right. Mm-hmm. I don't believe they've written access to a high-end gaming PC is considered a human right. And so I think that we will see continuing deployment of very, very high speed, very, very low latency broadband infrastructure mm-hmm. all around the planet. Yeah. And that will be an opportunity for everybody.
Yeah, no, for sure. And like the reason I'm excited about it and what I've been out there trying to connect with people about and evangelize is this idea that we'll be able to take what we know how to do and reach a much wider audience of people that don't consider themselves gamers right now. And then some of this may even sort of incite some controversy, I think, in terms of what we mean by game and gamer. But I'm hopeful that this will create a much more inclusive culture around interactivity. And maybe we need to alter some of our language around what it means, maybe not just a game, but interactive experience and taking players on a journey.
I hope so too. I mean, I look at Netflix, and so we talked a little bit earlier about Bandersnatch as the kind of interactive thing that Netflix started, and I thought that was really pioneering. And if anybody knows the true name Bandersnatch, where it comes from, does anybody know where that comes from? It comes from a Spectrum game in the 1980s, so that is dating it. But my kids, who are 7 and 9, they played on Netflix Man vs. Wild, mm-hmm. which is this Bear Grylls interactive show. It didn't cross their minds that this was complicated and amazing technology. It was just completely obvious to them that they would be able to turn on the television and start navigating this story in an interactive way. They never even went, wow, this is amazing. Whereas I'm sat watching on the sofa thinking, God, there's a lot of technology behind this. This is actually pretty, God, I wouldn't want to be the producer on this, exactly. Trying to plot out all of those combinatorials. But it was just, I think, symptomatic of the world we live in, that there is a generation of kids who consume media instantly on every device, and it never crosses their mind that these technologies should be in any way difficult.
I know. Those of us, all us old farts trying to figure this out, I mean, we should probably just hand the baton to these kids. So it's sort of like, we worry about, the demographic appeal and how we're going to appeal to people that are intimidated to pick up a controller or don't understand a certain interface. And of course, all of that's just going to eventually go away because we're going to have, we're going to die off, frankly, right? And then all these kids will be, coming in with just...
I think we've got a bit of time left in us yet.
I'm sorry. I'm just having one of those days. Phil, we're going to die. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like the problem I'm trying to solve sometimes is about trying to figure out how we widen our accessibility and discoverability to this audience. Meanwhile, of course, the younger audience coming up, and they surprise us at every turn, right? Because we have no idea like what they understand and how they discover things. I mean, this is why we get surprised by things like Fortnite, you know, or PUBG or Twitch, and I mean, any of it, right?
Sure.
Yeah. But to me, it's the most exciting thing is just the fact that we can be creating content. You know, the idea that, you know, not only will this stuff be just sort of like readily accessible, but probably also accessible through subscription services. That's one thing that's great about looking at the Netflix model, and of course the Netflix of games is overused and it's sort of a poor phrase. But you know, the Bandersnatch as an experience, the idea that you're in an ecosystem that you've already bought into, full of all kinds of content. You go, I'm a Black Mirror fan, and you go, oh well, look, here's a Black Mirror episode. Click and boom, you're in. So zero friction. And so I think that's our biggest challenge as an industry, is to figure out how we can be more exclusive and 10x the audience, if we want to even think about it mercenarily, is by thinking about what are all those barriers, and how do we knock them down and make this stuff more discoverable and more accessible.
I think one of the technical features of the Stadia platform, which hasn't really had a huge amount of focus from some of the commentary, but I think is going to be one of the most incredible things, is a feature called State Share, where you can watch somebody's gameplay on YouTube. You can click on that YouTube video and join the game at exactly that moment.
Right.
And this idea that you can set a challenge for somebody in the audience, whether it's your friend or one of your millions of subscribers, and say, I just beat this end-of-level boss in, you know, 14 seconds with the least powerful sword, see if you can do it.
Right.
And just to be able to lay that challenge out to the audience and have them click literally on that video, and then with no download, no patch, no install, be playing immediately.
Right. Yeah.
I think that will influence game design. And I think that there are some game developers that we've been talking to for some time now who really understand what that means for the way that will change narrative, the way that it will change the scripting of moments within a story arc, and how the idea of a cliffhanger now becomes playable.
Right.
And I think that's pretty exciting for people like you and for your friends in the industry, what that means for how you then tell stories and engage players in that journey through an entire story.
And the other stuff we were talking about was just the sheer processing power, right? That we've always been sort of constrained by whatever's in the box, right? And that is something that's not going to change. And you know, when I saw the presentation on Stadia before it was actually named, I got, you know, disclosed, and it was fascinating to just you know, think about the idea that, you know, there's racks of computers somewhere, and that as much horsepower as you need is at your fingertips.
I think that's right. For the last, let's say, 40 years, just to round it up, that we've been building games, we have been completely device-centric in the way we design a game. We come up with a game design, we decide we're going to run it on this specification of machine, and we build up to that capability, and we use our best technology and best creative efforts to cheat the extent of that technology, but we're still bound by the function that was in the Commodore 64, or the function that was in the Apple II, or the function that was in a high-end PC or game console. And everything that we developed as gamers, as game developers over the last 40 years has been device-centric. And with cloud gaming, and particularly with the idea of compute being shareable across multiple CPUs in a data center, now this transition to game development being data center centric is going to be a really fundamental shift. It will be a difficult shift as well. This is not going to be the easiest pathway for every studio to go through, but the developers who understand this, who can think about what that means for game design, what that means for distributed physics, what that means for massive simulation, what that means for complex multiplayer going from hundreds to maybe thousands or tens of thousands of players in a very sophisticated world, where every change that I make to my world can be instantly, in milliseconds or less, microseconds in many cases, be distributed to every other client who is playing that game. That is something that you can only do when all of the games are running on a data center. You can't do that when you have a discrete box.
Right, right. I know, it's mind-blowing. Actually, as a creator, it's even hard to wrap our heads around, I think, sometimes. You know, as a storyteller, one of the things I'm most excited about, too, is, you know, we talk a lot about the uncanny valley. We've talked about that for years, about, you know, characterization, character tech. And the fact is, that's not where the uncanny valley lies. We're actually pretty good these days at rendering really believable humans actually in real time, which I'm sure would be aided by this technology.
We're both simulations. We're not actually here in real life. This is.
That's right. I'm sure a simulation would do a much better job than
I kind of think Elon Musk might be onto something, by the way, when he says that. But anyway.
Probably so. But the idea is it's actually the uncanny valley of behavior, right? And when you think about the AI simulations that would need to be run to really have a believable community of characters that are just AI characters, not other players in the world, you know, that's something that's pretty hard to do in all of its nuances, right? So I'm hopeful that, you know, one of the evolutions that we're going to see is going to be in AI, which will help us cross that uncanny valley.
I think so too, and perhaps in time we will look back at a very key design decision that we made on the Stadia controller, which was to put a microphone in it. And the fact that you can then use conversational understanding and natural language to interact with your game world, where you could use, you know, this science fiction AI that Google and others have pioneered in ML, where you can have this conversational understanding with an NPC in this game world that you create, and they talk back in a way that is contextual and sensitive to what you've just told them, and they have a memory that is persistent through the entire arc of that game, multiplied by a combinatorial of thousands and thousands of NPCs in that world. That's a game I want to play. That's a world I want to live in. I mean, that's a Blizzard experience that I would love to have played. You know, where I'm not just relying on the chat of real people, I can actually immerse myself in that story. And because of the storage that we have in the data center, you can have this ginormous database written out in real time that then allows that to happen.
Yeah, and it touches on something else, which is obviously the machine learning side of this whole thing too, which, you know, I know is just new technology. It's not necessarily specific to Stadia, but the fact that the scale that we're creating these worlds and these stories and these experiences, and we talk a lot, and we share a lot of stories about crunch and, you know, and kind of what's happening to the industry and kind of what that tipping point is. You know, one of my hopes is that through machine learning, to aid us as creators, not to replace us, hopefully, that machine learning to aid us and fill in the blanks will still allow us to create as big experiences or even bigger, but, you know, that'll help us in environmental, you know, creation, in AI, in story, filling in all the stuff between the things that need to be deliberate and authored.
Sundar talked about this at the GDC keynote, where he said, although Google doesn't necessarily identify obviously as a games company, although actually with Android and YouTube and search and ads, we're actually a ginormous games company. We just don't talk about it in those terms. But we employ tens of thousands of people who grew up playing games, who started their interactions with technology through games. And many of them work in AI and ML in our brain team, working for a bunch of very brilliant people headed by Jeff Dean. And we spend a lot of time with that team thinking about how can we use ML to do one of two vectors in games. Either the issue that you just talked about, which is to make games cheaper or build content more efficiently.
Content creation,
And the other is how can we make games better? And so those two vectors are things that we're thinking very deeply about inside of Google, and what those tools mean and how we package those tools in a way that all developers and creators can then get access to, so that it's not just a rarefied atmospheric level of creator, it's everybody.
That it just lifts everything,
Correct.
Yeah, no, that's exciting, because I mean, again, the burden of doing this stuff, you know, one studio trying to tackle this, it's impossible, right? So the hope is, that the rising tide of this technology, led by companies like Google, will raise all of our boats. So we talked about it a little bit, but what sort of content do you think that, you know, cloud-based gaming will unlock that's different than the games we're playing right now?
I mean, there's obviously exciting innovations in some of the storytelling arcs that we've been talking about, what that means in believability of worlds and scale and complexity and multiplayer. And just multiplayer alone, by virtue of the fact that all data centers are connected by a very predictable connection, and what that means for the scale of multiplayer, I think is really exciting. But I'm also interested in changing the way that game value is perceived by players. Mm-hmm. Because today a lot of game value is perceived really because of retail store pressure. Right. Only so many games get retailed in a retailer, and only so many games are facing outwards at that retailer, and there's less and less of those retailers. Or whether you're talking about a digital store where you are, merchandised on a grid. Because of the discovery tools that we've built into the Stadia platform, and a game is a link, the internet is your store, that means that we can change the perceived value of games. And I'm going to pick a personal favorite, but I'm just going to use it as an example. A game like Inside from Playdead. I loved that game, and I really wanted to live in that world and play that world more. And I would love more games like that to be made, games that are purposefully, deliberately, absolutely single player. Maybe, I don't know how long it took me to play, probably longer than it should have done.
Well, if you savor it, yeah.
Yeah, no, actually I remember playing it. I had a broken collarbone at the time, so I couldn't really hold the controller very well. It was my sort of convalescence game. So that's my excuse for why it took a little bit longer to play. But I finished it, and I loved it. And I would love for more people to enjoy those kind of games as well.
Well, and that gets into the discoverability thing, which I think is so key to us, where we go next, right? Because there are a lot of brilliant games. Inside gets brought up a lot. So games like Firewatch, or What Remains of Edith Finch, or even something like Florence that ostensibly should be discoverable. But there's this audience of people that don't consider themselves gamers, even though of course they are, because we all are. It's part of our DNA. They have no idea how to find this stuff, and we're lousy at marketing it to them.
Well, if your funnel for discovery of those games is a specialty retailer like GameStop or the game aisle of Walmart, then
you have to be seeking it out in the first place. There's no sort of, when I say discoverability, I really mean discovering the fact that something like this even exists.
I completely agree, and I think that's why we're on this frontier of discovery and accessibility for games that gets rid of some of the artificial barriers that had previously been put in front of players. And that if you find a game that you really love and that you think I would love, you can send me a text message.
Right.
And you can say, click here to play it.
And it's just that simple.
And it's just that simple.
Hey, I recommend that you buy a $400 machine.
I recommend you go to the mall and buy it, or I recommend you download it for 4 hours. Those are things that are going to go away.
Yes, I recommend that you download. Yeah, and look, and some of this comes from, and this is controversial, I suppose, but this is also going to involve a dialogue around what we mean by gamer, and what we, and what are the failures of our language around interactive experience, and that not all games are about competition or beating or even mastery or difficulty, right? That we need to open up our verbs and make it so that these games are not just discoverable but also accessible. And that doesn't mean, of course, like we've talked about, that hardcore games or core gaming goes away. We're adding to our palette, right?
It's okay to be a gamer.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be some kind of hidden specialist superpower that you share by a funny handshake to kind of let other people know that you're a gamer.
Right.
And I think Dean touched on this earlier about how some of the negativity around games has created this exclusive culture, and we want it to be an inclusive culture.
Yeah, and
we
I'm
want
saying
everyone to play.
It doesn't sound like a controversial topic, right? But I think it may be, as we sort of, this is going to involve a dialogue around how inclusive we are,
right.
I think, which I'm looking forward to, actually.
But I don't think we have to apply the same rules of community to every single player.
Of course not.
I think we have to create these pockets of community, some of whom will be very purposefully separate from each other, and that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, and even the conversation around difficulty of games like Sekiro, right? It's sort of like, that game should be difficult. That's what it's about. Same with Celeste, right? But you know, we need to get over ourselves in some ways when we think about, like, you know, if you can't hang with the game, well, that means you're not a gamer. It's like, I mean, the people playing games on their iPads are gamers too.
Yeah,
right?
but I think
it's all stripes.
you know, the Sekiro difficulty level issue is like there's some pretty challenging 60s French cinema, you know, which is it's quite hard to get through.
There's no easy mode.
There's no easy mode on those things either, but they're just as relevant and they're just as impactful and influential in the overall.
Right. We don't want to make it homogenized, right? And that's not the point. But when we think about trying to reach a wider audience, what are sort of things that you see down the road for Stadia in terms of kind of easing people who don't consider themselves gamers into this experience?
I think we're very purposefully starting with a gamer type that is very familiar with AAA games and the kind of games that we will be bringing to our platform, both ourselves and in partnership with the industry. At launch will be familiar games and game types. But we know that in order to get to the significantly greater scale that we aspire to, we will have to go through a series of almost concentric rings of different types of games. That's why we have invested heavily in developer tools to make sure that we have empowerment for developers to get access to whether it's Unreal or Unity or other key middleware that will allow them to unlock their creativity more quickly.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, and you know, I reached out to some of my developer friends, as we talked about, to kind of ask some questions and then see what was on their minds about kind of the cloud gaming future. And obviously that was one of them, is just sort of what other sort of engines and things you'd be supporting. The other one that came up a lot was around the controller, and it's interesting because you did mention that, of course, one of the inputs could be voice, and that's something we're hearing a lot from, you know, from different platforms, actually. Yeah. But it's another thing that, again, like, you know, people coming up now, it's like they're just used to talking to devices in their home. You know, my 4-year-old niece, you know, talks to their, you know, little Google Home, like, you know, it's a person in the room. She calls it Dougal, but
okay.
It understood.
That's
figured
it
out. Yes. Hey, Dougal. But so that's an interesting thing. Like, in terms of, there's almost a, you think there might be sort of almost a performance aspect to gaming in some ways down the road?
There will be, and I mean, I think there already is with the way that, you know, creators on YouTube are part of that value chain. But I don't think we should be scared about the game controller. You know, I look at my kids and their friends. You know, they are completely adept and have been from the age of 4 on any kind of game.
So again,
control.
we just need to die off people that.
We need to die off, exactly.
Okay.
That's right.
The pull quote for the whole interview.
But actually, joking aside, I think that there is space in our platform in future for us to have different control methods, and you know, maybe there is a role for a simpler controller. And although this is not the same thing, I think there's often a confusion between accessibility and inclusion. Definitely a controller that is more inclusive is a good thing. Right. And I have to say what Microsoft has done with the accessibility of the adaptive controller is fantastic, and they should be congratulated for that.
Absolutely.
And so I think those kind of innovations that mean that anyone who can play games, I was reading an article recently that there are 15% of the world's population who are considered to have some kind of disability. And so I think anybody in games would think, if I had an opportunity to increase my audience by up to 15%, that would probably be considered a good thing.
Right.
So we fully support that initiative.
Yeah, that's very cool. And then I know, you know, Michael's sort of joking-ish, but around, you know, is there anything that you want to talk about around the business model? I know that's a lot of questions. I know you're also maybe waiting till your next beat, but if there's anything that you'd want to share, because I know a lot of my developer friends have burning questions about it.
No, I understand it's a question that we left unanswered from our GDC presentation. We're going to be back in the summer to talk in detail about how gamers will be able to buy and get access to games. At the time when we talk about the games themselves. So we will be back not too far in the distant future to talk about that. But our platform at a fundamental level has been architected to support a very wide variety of what people call monetization options, everything from purchase to transaction to subscription. So there's no technical limitation on how we have architected the platform to support a variety of business models.
Oh, that's great to hear. So we went over a bunch of the questions that I got from my dev buddies. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to cover out of that you remember?
No, I think
they all might be stuff that you want to wait till your next beat on.
No, I think we had a really great discussion on some of the themes and topics, but
yeah, I was just going to say, I just looked at the timer.
We have 9 minutes.
We've got about 9 minutes for Q&A.
Q&A. Maybe we could open it up to the room.
Come
David. How much does it cost to build games for Stadia? Well, as much or as little as you want to invest. I think that and as a David's a venture capitalist, so there's a very specific reason why he asked this question.
It's very exciting to hear, the vision of what might be built, but who's going to pay for it? How is it going to be affordable? Or will we just have machines learning?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. So every successive generation, and I think Michael talked about this very well in terms of how each new format and innovation in movie and television distribution opened up bigger and bigger audiences, and the ecosystem got bigger and bigger. And I remember looking at cost of development charts that you and I have probably looked at together in the past, where we were, oh my goodness, the average cost of development on transition from 8 to 16-bit, it's now over $1 million a game. Oh, whoa, how is the world going to make money from this? And then it went to 10 million, and then, there are many games that have been in development that are now 100 million plus. Now, not every game will be 100 million, nor should it be. And as I mentioned earlier, this decoupling of the industry from the retail-centric decision gate, I think will make a big difference to the value proposition of games in a good way for the developer, meaning that they can build smaller games. They can build games that are perfectly, beautifully crafted 5 hours of entertainment. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think we should see more of that at the right price. Now, obviously, there needs to be a scale of the platform to support that. And we were going to work hard to do that. But I think that, yes, there will be the big publishers who will invest triple-digit millions to build the absolute pinnacle of games. And then there will be everything down, from that point to things that I look at something like Roblox. I look at the democratization of Roblox and what that means for games. And is there a role for that kind of technology and experience in Stadia going forward? I would hope so. I also think that we will see new tools that make it cheaper and quicker for developers to build. I look at the 2,000 people credited in some of these big games, and I just question whether that is sustainable in the long term. I don't know that it goes to 5,000 or 10,000 people, but I do think that there are some tools and technologies that will enable games to be built for substantially less people.
And I'll say that's one of the things I'm excited about the most, too. Not only just the opening of the portfolio through this means, but also the fact that we can actually have smaller teams making smaller games at a smaller price point.
There's a question there.
You talked a bit about what is some of the feedback you're getting from the developers you're talking to now, and any surprises along the way, any feature changes because of these conversations?
What is the feedback we've had from developers? I think the main feedback that we got was invest as much as possible in development tools. Make it easy for us to build games. That's why we chose Linux. That's why we chose Vulkan. That's why we have partnered as broadly as we can across the industry with developers. One of the interesting bits of feedback we got when we presented the way that games will be discovered and the fact that the internet becomes your store through a game being a link, that really resonated with publishers as much as developers as a way of what's called in sort of performance marketing terms, closing the marketing loop. so that developers and publishers can invest money in connecting their game to the gamers that they want to target in the most efficient way, and what that means for discoverability and distribution of games. They were very excited by that. Yes?
Does Google Stadia have any plans to go into China? Have you guys looked at that as well?
Does Google Stadia have any plans to go into China, and have we looked at the Chinese market? It's obviously a huge market, and one that we would not ignore. We've announced that we are going this year in US, Canada, UK, most of Europe. It's unclear to me whether the UK will be part of Europe or not by the time we launch, but that's a whole different conversation. We haven't made any announcements beyond those initial countries. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, this is multi-layered, but where do you see your competition? It's such a new audience that you're going after, but there's also the core audience there. Are you PC? Are you console? Are you something else entirely? And then along with that, there's so much direct to consumer. You have Epic Games Store, you have Origin Games Store, you have Battle.net. How do you get the content developers to let the 40-year-old Italian man play FIFA when, no, we want that from Origin and I'm not going to do that? Like, what are your challenges there?
So our competition, we don't think of the market as, in order for us to succeed, somebody else has to fail. That's not how we approach the market. Google has, long before I joined the company, has had a very clear philosophy that in order for our platforms to be successful, the world needs to be successful on those platforms. So we have to create an opportunity for everyone. More specifically, we're changing the model. We're not being device-centric. We are screen agnostic. The same game, the same developer code, the same developer effort shows up on a mobile phone, a tablet, a web browser, a laptop, a PC, and a TV. And you can seamlessly move between those endpoints at the touch of a button. If you haven't seen the presentation that we did at GDC, we showed that demo live. In fact, just as an aside, we intended to show that demo running off a dev kit, but our dev kit didn't work. So we actually streamed that completely live from our data center in South San Jose all the way up to Moscone in San Francisco. It was easier for us to run it live off our real service than run it off a dev kit, but that's a different story. But the way that we think about our platform is that we're no longer device or screen centric. We are game centric. We are asking gamers to buy the game, not the platform. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering, when you talk about how this kind of platform really impacted game design, are you actually thinking about those different windows to be different experience for players for the same game? So when I play on mobile phone, or you play like the same type of experience that I play on consoles, or just more trying to make the games more, so they design different experiences?
So we know that some developers will think about input modality differently. So because we support mouse and keyboard and controller, we know that some developers will think about those cohorts of players slightly differently, and sometimes they will purposefully mingle them, and sometimes they will purposely keep them apart, and that's okay. But fundamentally, your investment as a game developer is a one-time code base, and it shows up on any of those platforms. But we do allow you to make tuning. So for example, when you're on a phone, you might want to slightly change the size of the on-screen display of HUD or information to make it more readable, but it's exactly the same game.
How does VR fit into all this?
VR is an area of research and innovation for Google, but we don't have anything to announce today. Yes?
What is the company line or Google's line on proliferation of broadband across markets that might not be very mature? If the banking apps are underway or things like that, is there any kind of a general statement you guys have on that sort of
We study broadband very carefully, as you can imagine, and very deeply. But in the markets that we will be launching and where we are planning to introduce in future, the broadband connectivity is more than sufficient to satisfy the most ambitious aspect of our plan. Remember, the bandwidth we require for somebody to enjoy Stadia at the highest level is only around 30 megabits per second, 35 megabits per second to get to 4K, 25 megabits for less. So, you know, it's not a massive bandwidth that we require. There's two over there. I'm going to point to the one on the floor first. There we go.
Hi, Michael House.
Hey, Michael.
Long time. Just want to hear some comments on your internal game studio developments and what your plans are for internal development.
Yeah, so as you will no doubt have heard, we have started Stadia Games and Entertainment, which is our in-house development studio. Very fortunate to have hired a seasoned industry executive producer in the name of Jade Raymond to run it for us. And initially we're working with external developers that we have signed to our platform. And we will be building our own internal studios from here on in, knowing full well that takes a bit of time to get to market.
Well, we're a minute over. Do we want to? We should get out of here. Is there sort of a breakout?
Oh, we've got a red flashing.
I know.
I apologize.
Yeah.
Okay, we are.
All right, because I think we can do a breakout Q&A outside as well.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you very much.
That was wonderful.
It's really nice
Thank you so much.
Spend time with you. Thank you.